Welcome, everyone. I would like to give my notes our moderator, Rene Bloom. Thank you very much.
Yes. Good afternoon, well, wherever you are, good evening, whatever have you. And yeah, I'm Lane Bloom. I'm an assistant professor of math at Culver Stockton College in Canton, Missouri. And we're excited to have all of you here, professors, students, grad students, guests, other esteemed academicians here today to talk about another rather timely topic of STEM education that is part of many different international conversations. And we have a wonderful panel with 4 esteemed members today. And let me see if I share my screen, this should, yeah. Okay, and as you can see, I'm getting the pinwheel of death here. So that's not the worst slide to get stuck on, I suppose. However, I'll be, the way this is going to work is that I will introduce our speakers, and then each of them will have 15 minutes to summarize their thoughts on these topics. And then we'll have a second go around with sort of a general summary here. That sound okay to everybody? Okay, so first up we have on our panel, Dr. Dion Cross-Francis, and she is an associate professor of math education in the Department of Culture, Curriculum, and Teacher Education at the University of North Carolina. Her BA is in math from the University of West Indies in Jamaica, and her PhD is in educational psychology from the University of Georgia. Her research interests are in relationships among psychological constructs such as belief, identity, and emotions, how the interplay of those constructs influence teachers' instructional decision-making prior to and during the act of math teaching. Dr. Cross-Francis is the recipient of the K-12 Promotion of Education Award from the 2014 Women of Color STEM Conference for Educators, with a demonstrated commitment to enhancing STEM career opportunities for women and minorities through the promotion of STEM education programs and exemplary teaching and outreach activities. Welcome, Dr. Cross-Francis. And second up, we have Dr. John Summers, and he is an associate professor of teacher education and coordinator of graduate programs at the University of Indianapolis. Dr. Summers completed his doctoral degree in educational leadership and curriculum and instruction at Indiana University in Bloomington. And he teaches courses in STEM, engineering, special education for elementary candidates and graduate students. He served as principal investigator on several national and regional grants, including the Next Generation Communities of Mathematical Practice, using apps, animation, and games to explore children's mathematical thinking, constructing a virtual community of mathematics practice amongst teacher education candidates, practicing teachers and teacher educators, creating a mathematics game lab, and creating and co-constructing accessible market spaces. Welcome, Dr. Summers. Our third panelist is Dr. Rivdan Elmas, and he is an associate professor of science education at Afyon Kokaktepe University in Turkey. He graduated as a chemistry teacher, and he completed his PhD in chemical education at Middle East Technical University in Ankara in 2012. And he's been a visiting researcher at University of Utrecht, FISIM in the Netherlands for 6 months. And you can see more of his esteemed, if I could get this thing to work, you can see more of his esteemed research work on this slide here, which I'm hoping to get up here at the end. And welcome, Dr. Elmas. And our fourth panelist is Dr. Amber Simpson at Binghamton University. And she is in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Educational Leadership. Her undergrad degree is in mathematics, secondary education from Eastern Tennessee State University. Her master's is in curriculum and instruction and educational specialist degree in education administration and supervision from Lincoln Memorial University. So she was a high school mathematics teacher for 5 years in Tennessee before returning to Clemson to do her PhD work in curriculum and instruction, math ed. She's interested in examining maker education in adolescent learning of STEM related practices, as well as ways to engage families within the process of making. Okay, so, and then also interest in STEM identity, which is going to be something that I'm interested to hear about on this panel. So welcome, Dr. Simpson. Okay, would Dr. Cross Francis like to be first to share her thoughts on these topics? About 15 minutes on the first pass. Do we have her here? No.
We cannot hear.
You can't hear me.
Can you hear me now?
No, Francis, I cannot hear.
Oh, hold on. Okay.
Can you hear me now? Yes, no.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear now.
We heard you.
Okay, perfect. All right, welcome everyone, and thanks for inviting me and for the introduction. That was really great. I think what I'll share today is specifically around the question of what constitutes integrated STEM and what are some of the factors that we want to consider if we want to have effective implementation. And I'm specifically going to focus on that particular area because that's kind of what I've been working on and my focus coming from the position of being a mathematics educator. And when I've worked with colleagues, what we've tried to do is to ensure that none of the concepts or constructs that we're integrating is privileged over the other, meaning that we want students as they engage with the work to be able to meaningfully draw and learn the worthwhile and big ideas of all of the subjects that are involved. One of the pushbacks from the math community is that when it comes to STEM, science often gets prioritized, and the way that math is used is more for utility purposes, and students, especially in the K-12 environment, don't really get the opportunity to engage with mathematical thinking and those mathematical ideas. What it's used as is more in a procedural sense. And so one of the things that I've been working on is how do we actually integrate multiple disciplines under the STEM umbrella in ways that mathematics and the others are taught and are engaged with in really meaningful and useful ways. And also not only just understanding the construct richly, but also the ways that the construct is deployed in application and being used to solve problems. And so in this initial work, we really struggled with this. Initially, and I work more in the K-6 space, most of the projects that we designed were around statistics and data collection. And that was primarily working with science. That was a really strong common place where we knew that we could get the students to engage richly in the statistical and analytical cycle and really learn about how to develop real questions to investigate real problems, have them design what our approach is to actually going around and collecting information or data, and then how to actually meaningfully analyze or think about that data to address the problem at hand. And the context we usually explore these statistical ideas would be in science or engineering. But of course, that's really limiting. And if you know the K-6 curriculum, it actually is very, very thin on statistics. You really get into that more into middle school, and even then it's not richly kind of explored. You kind of have to wait until, upper bordering on AP stats before you kind of get into any really rich kind of discussions and thinking about that. And so kind of branching out, thinking about, well, what are some of the other rich mathematical areas and how can we meaningfully kind of integrate that with engineering and science, and also the use of technology, which also sometimes get treated as a utility for utility purposes in STEM, meaningfully do that. We started to explore what are some of the considerations that we need to have in order for no teacher or no subject to be exploited, but richly and treated with the integrity that it deserves, and also engage students in meaningful and engaging learning. And so some of the factors that have been talked about in the literature are what I have here. Like, you want to think purposefully and intentionally about how you're designing the curriculum. And when I say curriculum, I'm talking about curriculum broadly. So it could be a project, it could be an activity, it could be a design challenge, or it could be, if you're in a state that is moving towards STEM schools, how do you actually literally design the curriculums and pull together standards in ways that are going to actually address those purposes? So there are two ways in which the literature talks about this curriculum, pulling from the English literature base, where they talk about broad fields curriculum versus subject-centered curriculum. A broad fields curriculum is where you're looking at or trying to really integrate the ideas, right? So that might, if you think about a project, it might be thinking about what are the ways, what are compatible constructs within each of the disciplines that you want to integrate, and then you design the project around that to solve a meaningful problem. What we've done in our work is that we've actually first started out with actually finding partners in industry who are wanting to collaborate with K-12 institutions who are STEM professionals and are going to support us in developing and designing these problems. We've worked with in the hotel industry. We've also worked with the military and military contractors, and so kind of dabbled more in with engineers and with builders and designers in that space. In the projects that we've designed, more on the cusp of middle school, high school, we've worked with actually starting with, tell us about your work. What do you do? What do these problems look like? And then starting with an actual problem that they have to solve, and then trying to tailor it to meet the standards of school. So that's where sometimes we have found like a center point between raw fields and subject centered, because the schools that we're working with are still subject centered. They do not have an integrated way of thinking about curriculum or integrated structure or of scheduling to facilitate this kind of implementation, and teachers are still subject centered. And so we have had to find that kind of sweet spot in the middle, where the project itself is designed to integrate these ideas, but then we've had to parse it out by subject to support teachers in their goals that they've had to meet, and then also to be able to really get kids to kind of unpack and delve deep into the concepts of those individual disciplines. And so is it the best way to go about it? Not necessarily, but it's the way that we've had to compromise particular things in order to serve the multiple needs of the partners that we are working with. Schools are still organized the way they are. Administrators still administer and structure and manage schools in the way that they've done. So when you're working in a traditional structure, you definitely want teacher buy-in and you want administrator buy-in. And so you have to be able to serve the needs of that community. When you're partnering with industry is, whilst they want to benefit the community, they're also really invested in creating a pipeline for their organizations. And so they want rich problems to work on. And they also want, if they're getting partners, as in they're coming in as volunteers, they also want to work on rich problems that are integrated and that mirror the context in which they're working. And so the sweet spot that we found was keeping the problem as authentic as it can be, meaning more broad fields, but then parsing it out by subject area so that teachers' needs can be addressed. And that they can, be teaching students in the particular subject area, but then also finding time where those students who are working on the individual pieces of the project come together and they can work in an interdisciplinary fashion to kind of learn and build off each other. Another key area that we also had to think about was how are students going to engage in this project, right? So they're in the classes, and most of our classrooms were still kind of teacher-centered, even though the push is towards more student-centered. So what is a way of going about these problems that is authentic to STEM and also creates a framework for how what teachers can draw on in terms of thinking about how to engage students? The engineering design process has been kind of promoted by the new NGSS standards. It also dovetails really nicely with mathematics in terms of the problem-solving cycle. And this is this approach to thinking about unpacking a problem, generating strategies, trying things out. In engineering, you're actually oftentimes building something. You're building a prototype. When you're working with engineers, it's not just the cerebral activity that you're involved in. They actually want a prototype. Build something, test it, fail, and try again. Until you come with not one solution, but the best of the multiple solutions that you have derived. And so, as you can imagine, teachers don't often work in that space. And so you have to be really thoughtful about how do you engage them in thinking differently about how their curriculum is going to unfold and how the tasks that they're engaging their students in, how is that going to unfold in a way that meets the needs, everybody's needs. Students are learning, students are engaged, and the engineers, they're actually learning about the real work of what STEM professionals do. So thinking about what are some of the considerations in terms of the facilitation of this kind of integrated STEM, right? It's one, getting teachers up to speed in terms of how to think about their concepts in flexible ways that it will actually serve to solve the problem at hand or to complete the project. And that requires some focused time and effort and energy because teachers are often not supported in thinking about their concepts and the constructs they teach in these ways. And so we have partnered with industry and also the university teacher educators to really develop professional development instructors that can support this kind of work. But we also work with the professionals and administrators as well. They also have to think differently about how they structure schooling. And we've also worked with our partners, our volunteers, to think about, well, you're not in a space where you're working with all experts. You're in a space where you're working with people who have different kinds of expertise that's different from what you're used to. And how do you navigate that space in ways that it's productive for all? And one significant challenge, and I think maybe Amber might mention this, is this notion of failure. In the work of STEM professionals, failure is something that they experience daily, all the time, and they are fairly comfortable in operating in that space. Teachers and students, not so much. There is an emotional challenge. There's an emotional kind of a significant emotional hurdle with constantly trying things out and you not getting the result that you designed. And so we have our partners and volunteers in this regard have been extremely helpful in really helping them to understand how to interpret that, how to manage and navigate that, and how we have to reconceptualize what we mean by mistakes and failures, right? These are all learning opportunities and important learning opportunities. And sometimes they're the best way of figuring things out is to try something and it not work. You're adding to your toolbox of knowledge that is going to help you in that next iteration that you're going into. And so this notion of starting with a problem, unpacking it, and continuously going around until you're building this knowledge towards a solution is something that is not well integrated into science classes or even math classes, even though we have these structures that would support that. They're oftentimes seen as linear processes instead of iterative or cyclical processes. And so by incorporating the engineering design process as a framework, it's helped us to reconfigure or reorganize how we think about supporting students in terms of thinking and managing the work that they have to do. And then in closing, one thing that oftentimes get overlooked is the larger context in which we are trying to integrate STEM. We're trying to integrate integrated STEM into schools and classrooms. And that is the administration and just the infrastructure of these spaces in K-12 classrooms, which requires being thoughtful about scheduling. Is there ever a time where all of these classes can meet? Can we actually structure it so they're all meeting at the same time? Or can we actually mix kids across classes throughout the semester so that they're building and learning from each other in the kind of integrated and interdisciplinary way that we would want them to? It requires buy-in from the administration. Trying to do this as a one-off project where you're just kind of working with some teachers on the side and you don't have the administrative structural support is not the best route to go about it, because you're thinking about putting teachers in a position where they have to modify their curriculum and they're going to be accountable to their administrators. So once we get everybody, it's difficult enough, even when you have administrators on the same page, but not having them being invested in what you're trying to do is not necessarily going to be in the best interest of your project, working with teachers, working with students, and really facilitating a positive outcome. And that's in the literature, it's actually one of the more stressful aspects of this work for teachers, is when they're left to have to navigate the environment in which they're in, and to try to create that infrastructure independently without buy-in from the administrators and those people who make decisions about how schools and classes are structured. And so I'm just gonna stop there. So that's kind of some of the things that we're navigating and working on in the work that we're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Cross-Francis. And to the organizers, so we are going to go through this and then have questions. That was what you had in mind, correct? Go through all four and then I'll take that as a probably. Okay, so next we're on to Dr. Summers. Yes.
Oh, I'll stop sharing. That would be helpful.
It seems that you're still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, excellent.
Yeah. Okay, now I'll present here. Does that look good? Yep. Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody. I just was taking frantic notes as Dr. Cross-Francis was talking, because much of what she said was very emblematic of some of the issues we're facing as well. So what I did, I should tell you, I'm from Indiana, University of Indianapolis, and Indiana is a state that is really STEM-centric and problem-based learning-centric. So we have a system of schools that can become STEM certified. And then the Indiana Department of Education also recently just released a set of standards for elementary school teachers to become STEM certified, so they can take a licensing test. About 2 years ago, we completely turned our elementary education program upside down, and now it's a STEM elementary education program in which all of the students take a host of different STEM courses. And one of those courses that I teach is Introduction to Engineering. And I'll try to integrate some of that into this conversation we're going to have. I got to start my timer here so I don't run over. Sorry about that. What I did, so I'm John Summers at the University of Indianapolis. And this was the first question, and I kind of chose a couple questions and kind of went down a couple rabbit holes to read about what the literature says. But the first one is about, as we know, a variety of understanding about what STEM is and what's really, and how do we define it. So what was really interesting about reading all of this are all the variations of definitions about STEM. And this is one of my favorite ones that I found from the Washington STEM group. STEM literacy is the capacity, and I think capacity is a really important term, to identify and apply content from STEM knowledge areas to understand and resolve those problematic situations that cannot be concluded from a monodisciplinary approach. And we'll talk more about that, but I really like the idea behind thinking about the capacity of students and teachers to identify and apply this content. I'm on a member of a NSF grant it's called Engineering for All, in which it's a high school engineering class that is designed so that all students can participate in engineering and also enjoy the benefits and really learn the EDP, the engineering design process. And it was amazing. Last week, there was a celebration in which all the teachers, there are 19 states involved across the United States in the project, and the teachers presented some of the projects that the students ended up doing. And it was just absolutely fascinating how they've integrated engineering into different STEM areas and so forth. One of the projects, I'll just do a little, one of the projects was for an older lady who did not know when to go to the mailbox. So she had to walk to the mailbox. So the students created a signaling device that when the mail went into the mailbox with an Arduino, it sent a signal to the individual's home, and then she knew the mail had been delivered, and then she could go up and get her mail. So there were projects just like that across the United States, which is fascinating. But when we look at the different conceptualizations of STEM, I grabbed these from NSF, some of the different grants, but we have STEAM that integrate the arts. We have C-STEM that's about creative arts and communication. We have STEM plus C, which integrates computing. We have E-STEM, which is, this one was about STEM for elementary schools, a project, NSF project. And also we have E-STEM, environment. The list goes on and on forever. So in terms of conceptualization, we have to, I think you'll see in a minute that our definitions are very vast, which is maybe a good thing. But anyway, multiple conceptualization of STEM, and we have kind of a couple camps talking about integrative STEM versus STEM integration. And so Barron and others talk about integrative STEM, in which we integrate teaching and learning with STEM, and it's a dynamic process. One informs the other with a real focus on students. The other one about STEM integration, it's more teacher guided, more student centered. It's very driven by student questions and their need to know, kind of along the ideas of project-based learning. But it is the integration of kind of conceptual and pedagogical framework. And that's from Wells. Let me keep going. So one of the articles I really enjoyed, we were talking about maybe how we should think about it, is the work that's been doing at Project Zero at Harvard, and to think about interdisciplinary knowledge. And it's again, the capacity to integrate knowledge and modes of thought in, two or more disciplines. And so to produce cognitive development where students can explain, they can design, they can create, they can produce solutions that address a social human need. Let me just keep going here. So this was a quote from one of the papers, that the most exciting science in the 21st century is likely to evolve among not within traditional disciplines, yet the education of sciences has historically been constrained by disciplines paralleling patterns of science funding. So this is the idea of pushing the boundaries, of boundary crossing, and how we can integrate different disciplines into a collective whole. And so we're back to Roger Bybee in 2010 wrote a paper called What is STEM? And I think we're still struggling with what is STEM. And I really like Roger's kind of the way he captured some of this at the bottom there. Is we want to help students understand how things work. We want them to improve the use of technology. We want them to learn how to design, how to problem solve, and how to improve society. I just thought, oh, okay, that is pretty much what we're all trying to do. The other thing, NSF, from a couple authors, that NSF had a couple papers talking about what should STEM include. And as you look here, it's everything but the kitchen sink: chemistry, computers, technology, geosciences, social sciences, and psychology. And so how to create some manageable conceptualization of STEM, I think we're still struggling with that. Oops, let me go this way. So one thing that really emerged from the literature, and I think Dr. Cross Francis really addressed this, is that we have to be very intentional when we design our learning tasks and our units. And I know I struggle with that in the Introduction to Engineering course. And Shanahan talks about we have to take STEM and create this synthetic whole. And when the parts, the sum is greater than the parts. And it has to be standard driven. But then we have to put this into an authentic context. And it has to be articulated with the content. It has to have a challenge. It has to be accessible. In our makerspace, we have one table that goes up and down. Somebody in a wheelchair, if they came into our makerspace, that's the only basically place they could actually manage the makerspace. And when we look at our tools have not been created in a way that they're accessible to people with different disabilities. So that's an area that I'm very much interested in and try to work in. Then the learner, we have to think about the learner. Are we creating equity for the learner? Are we trying to instill agency? We have to think about the cognition, the attitude, and the interests of the learner. And we have to design learning tasks that take all of this into consideration. Real quickly, I know I'm running. I guess I'm okay. Another rabbit hole I went down was looking at the assessment. How do we assess them? And this was just really very, very interesting. So a couple of the papers, they talked about that there's, STEM has only been around, like most people put it around 1990. It's been around for like 20 years, something like that. So it's kind of a young, discipline. So some of the authors talked about, we really have inadequate research on assessing students' interdisciplinary knowledge. And in the engineering class that I do, I struggle with how to assess their discipline knowledge, how to assess their practices, how to assess their skills, and so forth. And I may have found a really good paper here, and I'll share it with you in just a second. And then a lot of the research looked at, how do we assess content? Then how do we assess the skills? And then how do we assess the effective domains? And then the thing that makes it really difficult is that we're going to assess these learning tasks that are situated in these complicated, authentic situations in which students are applying knowledge from across multiple disciplines. They could be applying knowledge across, 3 or 4 different disciplines. So how are we going to assess that? So here are some things that came out, some ideas that came out from the readings that I kind of delved into. And this was, one of these was a literature review that looked across a number of research articles about assessment. And one thing they found out was, as they looked at the assessment formats, not only in the research, but in the classroom, these formats varied greatly, all the way from open coding to multiple choice tests and so forth, to portfolio critiques. But several of the studies assessed the affective domains, so student agency, student confidence, and so forth, which is a little, and mostly through survey data and interviews. So that's a little more accessible. So I think that's one of the reasons why so many of the studies focused on affective domains. And then the other thing the review found out was that the assessment of interdisciplinary knowledge and practices were very diverse in format, all the way from video analysis, open coding, more qualitative, and far less in number, because it's difficult to do. Some of the assessment methods that researchers looked at and studied were very cumbersome for classrooms. So one of the bottom point there is that as we need to help practitioners give them guidance about how to select assessments for different purposes, for different domains, and for different contexts. It was interesting, and I even thought of myself, what I do in the engineering class, I assess their final project, but I really haven't found a good way to assess their iterations along the way. And this is one of the findings from one of the literature reviews, is that particularly in engineering, we look at the final product, but we don't look at how students did the problem scooping, how they iterated, how they improved their design, how they revised their design, and so forth. So what's that formative assessment that we need to do to enhance student thinking, critical thinking, and so forth? The other one was there were just a few, I think there were only 7 in this particular review, longitudinal studies. Most of them were pretty short-term studies. So we have to find a way to see if this STEM knowledge and these STEM skills are, sticking and lasting, beyond the short term and so forth. I think this is my last slide. So am I okay on time? Yeah, okay. So another thing that I have struggled with in our makerspace and also in engineering and also working with schools is trying to find tools to give, assessments, to give students formative assessment, to give them feedback. And then also it's very difficult to measure critical thinking, problem solving, creativity. And there's one study, and sorry, it's down, the names are down at the bottom, but it was a study in which they designed some really good rubrics to address critical thinking, problem solving, and it's called the ELLIPS rubrics. And I think I'll stop there, but I just want to say a couple things that in terms of Dr. Cross Francis remind me of. One of the challenges that I have is student persistence. When they hit failure, and these are mostly first and second year students, they stop and they look to me, or my TA, who's in mechanical engineering, they look to us to say, okay, tell us what to do. And when we say, let's think about, and we start probing with questions, you can see that they become very uncomfortable. So we have to find a way to work through that. In math, we call it productive struggle. And I'm always saying, okay, let's stop and let's talk about the productive struggle that we're having so we can work our way through it. And I really loved what Dr. Cross Francis said about bringing in folks from the outside to talk about, what happens when we hit failure and hit the wall and don't know where to turn and so forth. The other thing we got to do second semester is my students got to go out and work with 80 fourth graders. And we tried to do the STEM thing. We created interactive posters with Scratch and Makey-Makeys in which the students presented their animal research through very expressive means. And it was really neat. And then we did also called generational poems, in which the fourth graders created generative poems in which they would hit a aluminum foil on their poster, and then the character on Scratch would pop up and start talking and generate poems for them. And then we also got to do a robotics unit with kindergarten first graders, and also use Scratch with that and created robotic stories. And so, I got to stop.
Okay.
And I'll just tell you one more thing. One of the evaluations back from one of the students, or several of them, but they all really enjoyed and had not thought about how to bring things like math and literacy and engineering together to build a better unit. So they were fortunately for me, very happy at the end. Thank you.
No, thank you, Dr. Summers. Yeah, and it's interesting to see sort of the themes developing as we're seeing some similarities in the presentations that I feel we're going to continue to see with our other 2 panelists as well. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Elmas.
Lynn, can you put the latest slide you show us, you display us in the introduction part?
The panel questions?
Yeah, please.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm the only Turkish participant, but the problem is I'm in Bulgaria now because of several meetings. So I was in a hotel and I tried to do my best with the hotel because there are some internet connection problems here. but I think I can manage to do that in time and without interruption. And as you know, they posted us several questions, and I would like to talk about a little bit in Turkish context, because as Dr. Summers mentioned, there is a wide range of definitions, understandings, and applications of STEM similar to the worldwide in Turkey. Some apply this as a one-step, one-shot activity in 1 to 2 hours, and there are established research teams that develop STEM modules that frames in engineering design process and work more comprehensively. I'm one of the team members of these teams that we name it iSTEM. The emphasis is on integration, and the website is the stemmodules.com if you would like to look at it or investigate it. As you can expect, I work with my colleagues from different disciplines to develop the modules that STEM modules that has better integration of disciplines and a solid structure for students. As you can infer from the short introduction I have made so far, it's common in Turkey, unlike the United States, that STEM education approach is perceived as a teaching methodology and primarily applied in this way, not a curriculum development approach. Although there is an emphasis on STEM education approach in Turkey's current science curriculum, unfortunately, there is a severe weakness. The basic structure is not framed on the STEM education approach and the engineering design process. There are sentences or paragraphs that mentions that emphasis on that focuses on STEM education, and they are talking about it. They are right. They wrote it in the document, but when you look at all the learning objectives and when you read all the curriculum beginning to end, you didn't see really the engineering design process and all the needs the STEM education approach give importance. Also, in Turkey, I think also it's a word. It has the same usage in the worldwide. STEM is also used as a synonym, and it's widely used when only these disciplines are discussed. For instance, it's possible to say that STEM disciplines are mentioned in discourse, such as girls decreasing interest in STEM disciplines, and this is not the use of STEM word in the context of the STEM education approach. So we should be careful about that too. When it comes to the definition of the STEM education approach, as Dr. Summers mentioned, a very good one of them, but our team also has one definition for STEM education approach, and we define it as an educational approach that integrates science, technology, engineering, and mathematics disciplines to solve real-life problems, facilitates the understanding of real-life problems in the framework of engineering design with interesting and motivating experiences. And it's not only product-oriented, but also process and skill-oriented. We wrote an article about it in the University of Boğaziçi Faculty of Education journal, and its name is Characteristics and Evaluation of STEM Education Approach. If you would like to look at the details of the definition, you can, I would like to mention that. And if we need STEM education approach in the information age, I think this is a really interesting question, because in fact, I think that the problems such as decreasing interest in engineering fields that STEM education approach is especially established to resist are not at the forefront for Turkey as much as America. The reason is that engineering is still a job with high social status and a good income in Turkey. This makes it still a highly preferable option for Turkish citizens in the university entrance examination. And for this reason, the quotas of many high-quality universities in engineering departments are already fulfilled. I think the critical disadvantage of Turkey in this regard is the problem of quality of engineering education. I think the STEM education approach can make a profound contribution to us more better understanding of the nature of engineering. And STEM education approach in teaching and learning process. What I see is human beings are currently undergoing a process of metamorphosis. And I think we can expect that this is the period where the ongoing process of evaluation has peaked. The adventure that started with the Homo sapiens was evolved into Homo faber with the Industrial Revolution. The person, Homo faber means the person who makes the tools. And I think then it evolves to Homo videns with the start of the Web 1.0, because with the development of internet, we are just looking at the screens, and we some kind of dependent on the screen. So I think now it first evolves to Homo faber, to which the person who makes the tools, and then to Homo videns, the person who sees, who looks at. And now I think it evolves to Homo ludens, the person who plays with the social media and all the contribution of the people to the internet. I even think that it evolved into Homo intellectus. Probably some of you heard about it. Friedrich Nietzsche really talk about this concept in different contexts, but I like the concept, so I just put it into my process. Because I think those most of you have been following the recent developments in the biotechnology will agree with me at some level, because we are going to some kind of superhuman thing. So at the beginning of what makes this metamorphosis powerful are severe changes in the paradigms and the media in our life. And what I see from the general literature and also the news and also how the world evolves, the background of this metamorphosis was conceptually established. For instance, many of you have ideas about the Industry 4.0, Society 5.0, dark factories, the transition from robots to cobots, which robots who can cooperate each other to produce something together as a team, which I think is really change the paradigms of the industry and also how we look at the jobs in our life. So in an environment where both people and the media are changing so rapidly, the question arises whether we need a pragmatist approach to education, focused more on design and skills than information. I would like to explain a little bit why I assume the STEM education approach is pragmatist, because the student needs to learn sufficient to produce different solutions to the given problem. She gets enough information to produce reasonable solutions to this problem. By applying this, it can develop itself cognitively and effectively, also with the group interaction. Now, in the near future, I do not see the problem of accessing information. Still, knowing how to quickly access the right or needed information to solve the problems, because this process is all comprised of attention for the STEM education, a excellent opportunity for us. The integration issue is really hard, I think, because there are so many understandings about that. Also, Dr. Summers has a really good slide on that, because if you are making an integrative STEM, or we are focusing on the STEM and integration of disciplines in STEM. In fact, the issue of integration can be overcome by the work of different experts together and the establishment of the main backbone on the engineering process. In general, if you look at the current applications, we see that the STEM modules prepared commonly are mainly focusing on science. Also, Dr. Summers has a slide on that, which disciplines has to be in. I'm talking to a group of education here. I will tell you the following advice. Please STEM modules where mathematics is at the forefront because STEM education should not stay just time. Mathematics has to be on the forefront. I think a second problem that I experienced in my country is using the STEM education design elements that create problems with integration. For example, to title engage, evaluate. You know, I think it's problematic because STEM education is not and teach more comprehensive. And the essential characteristics to important or
Have we lost our speaker?
Yes.
It seems that we have. That's unfortunate. I didn't hear much the last minute or so. I'm not sure if everyone else was having the same issue. It seemed from reactions that may be the case, but wherever you are, Dr. Elmas, thank you very much. That was rather provocative. I'm very interested to see what kind of questions are followed up from there as well. And now we're moving on to Dr. Simpson to discuss her stuff, and I will turn the screen over to her.
Thank you. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about, so not sharing a slideshow, so you get to look at just me, sorry. But I thought, again, I picked a few questions to really focus on. And one of the things my own research has been in makerspaces in general. You know, thinking about design challenges. I've really worked with families on how do you use items in your home? What recyclable material can we repurpose? Educational robots has been some of the research that I've done. I've done environments ranging from after school programs to museums and libraries to home environments to maker spaces in schools. And I've done this with a range of children, anywhere from preschool to families to high school students. And being an assistant professor, I feel like I'm still evolving and really trying to come to an idea about STEM education. And one of my things that I've been thinking about in terms of a definition is it's really a human endeavor that supports children reaching their potential, both as an individual and a citizen, in creating a better world, whatever that better world is for them. And that they have opportunities to use and explore STEM principles, practices, the skills, the knowledges within cultural and meaningful contexts and situations, using either informal or formal ways in the moment. So what in the moment makes sense for them? So for an example, I've done a lot of paper roller coaster activities, right? So they use cardstock to create sort of a roller coaster that a marble goes from the top to the bottom. And usually they have to build some kind of supports to hold up their roller coaster. Rarely, actually, I've never seen anyone use a ruler to do that. They may compare, they may build one and then use comparisons to figure out what's the height. They might use trial and error. They have often used estimation. I've seen people use body parts, but never a ruler. So if you think about that within a context of a school, that may be frowned upon because it's not maybe accurate. It's not very precise. However, they are engaging in mathematics. What you might think of as like a craftsmanship version of like precision, indirect measurement. And there is a lot of research that talks about what does math look like in workplace environments. And so starting to think about this again as a human endeavor outside of what we might see as mathematics in school environments is really where my thinking has started to move. And I think as everyone has said before me, there is a lot of challenges to do this in school environments. When I go into schools during the day, indoor recess time, I always have kids say, how am I going to be graded on this? And I'm like, no, there's no grade, like this is fun. And I even find myself as a researcher that has went into these spaces trying to sort of shift my ways of formal education to be more informal. I find I struggle with things. I call it like a tug of war or like a rubber band where my formal education self keeps coming into play. So I've done a self-study where I wore a GoPro camera, and one of the things in my research, makerspaces STEM, the activities should promote exploration, creativity, and innovation. And what I find myself doing in those spaces is sometimes my question becomes really focused, right? Or I may take the object and do it when I'm like, I know not to do that, but you don't think about it in the moment. It's always been in my reflection back when I've watched videos and I'm like, what am I doing, right? And so I think it's a mindset that it's going to take years to sort of overcome who we are and what we know to be sort of schooling, right? Like pedagogical practices, things like failure. So like, as Dion said, I've done work on failure, but I intentionally removed opportunities for kids to fail in some of these instances, like with the roller coaster. We told them not to do a loop because I just know loops are always gonna fail. And so there's added pressure of time. I feel like there's added pressure of parents. Kids have to have something that functions. And so all of that come into play when, again, I know not to do all of those things. When I do this work with undergraduate and graduate students, it's the same type of tensions where they always think there has to be a connection to STEM, like, oh, I need to be asking science questions. I'm like, no, kids are engaging in STEM practices without them knowing, right? It's a very hidden thing oftentimes. And so I think that's the beautiful thing that I'm noticing is it's happening, right? So you don't have to encourage it or push it or name it. Kids are engaging in STEM practices. And as I've watched videos, I've tried to really think about the mathematics, and that's where I've shifted a little to think about, does this necessarily have to be in schools, or can we really start to think about out of school context and what those might add? Because trying to bridge the two seems very difficult. Trying to make it relevant to students' cultures, that's very difficult. So what I've happened upon is, as Dion noted too, engineering seems to be where a lot of my research is and where I'm seeing a lot of mathematical moments arise in the task and activities themselves. So what I find that's really unique about the engineering is when we develop an engineering task or an activity, you don't necessarily have the math that's going to happen in mind, but math is happening. And I've actually learned a lot from watching families. And so I want us to think as a field what parents can bring to their kids' STEM education. So I've got a few examples of like these moments where I would have thought have happened, and I've been amazed by what parents can do. And it sort of hits on that humanizing ways of doing STEM. So for example, we have asked families to sort of develop their own self-identified engineering problem. So as opposed to us coming in and say, every family, we're going to do this, every family comes up with a personal sort of problem to solve. And one child decided she wanted to create a robot that would deliver food to people that couldn't get out of bed. And so they used a Roomba, and she was constructing the tray to put food in. And they were thinking about the PVC pipes. So they were trying to think, what size should I cut the PVC pipes? And they were trying to do conversions. And the child was using the tablet and saying centimeters to inches. So she was trying to figure out what's the conversion. And her mom reached over and said, why are you using a tablet? Let me give you a tape measure. How might you use a tape measure to figure out 8 inches? How do you convert 8 inches to centimeters? And so it was a very informal way to think about that conversion, right? There wasn't the tablet, there wasn't a calculator that was used. or writing down and converting it by hand, right? But how can you use a tape measure to figure out what 8 inches is into centimeters? And so I thought that was a useful way to use a tool. It was an informal way to think about mathematics, and it led to even the importance of accuracy and how do you read decimals. And so that was one example. Another example that I've really found fascinating is we have developed an engineering kit where they develop a rain gauge. So they use LED lights, and they, as the rain fills up or the water, the LED lights sort of come on. And in our instructions, we talked about sort of using a ruler to measure the cup in centimeters, millimeters, inches, whatever they prefer. One family decided they wanted to do volume instead of looking at it in terms of length measure. And what that led to was a really interesting conversation about how the volume would actually change the length measure. So what was happening is they filled it up with 30 millimeters. The daughter or the child noticed that she called it the spacing. So the spacing between her lines were becoming smaller because the cup was smaller on the bottom and it was getting bigger at the top. So in a way, they started talking about sort of this indirect effect of how the volume was impacting the spacing or the length measures on the side of the cup. So really kind of planting those seeds of proportional reasoning or indirect measurement, in what was happening, like this inverse relationship. And again, that arose in the moment with this cup that we never thought would have such an impact on the mathematical conversation that happened. So I guess my takeaway is think about what informal spaces can bring to STEM education and the potential role of families. Again, I'm not going to say that every family would engage in these mathematical moments, but parents have some value and knowledge that they could add to the to what their kids know about STEM. Thank you.
All right, excellent. So it seems, so again, our speakers were promised 15 minutes and this is a 1-hour session. So it's a little perplexing as to what the goal is here. However, I do think that it would be excellent if we could take some questions from the audience for a little while here, for a few minutes.
Can I ask a question? Yeah,
Yes, sir.
first, I want to say thank you for all of you. Thanks for coming, and I'm really happy to see all of you here. And my questions, I want to ask the first question to Dr. John Summers. And you asked, you mentioned it was an interesting point assessing iteration and assessment iteration in STEM. Am I right? And if so, what you mean? Could you explain it a little more, please? I try to understand, because when we use the engineering design process, EDP, and with that, we, for example, use the Dr. Moore's framework, and end of that, our students also check it. If there was any problem, they can return the previous stages. And there is iteration. If they are trying to again rebuild or check the problem, where is it? And it seems also a kind of process for me, but I'm trying to understanding what you mean with that point. If you can explain a little more, thank you very much.
So if I understand the question, how do you assess the iteration and the prototyping probably as it evolves? Am I on track?
Yeah.
So what the research says, and in my experience, is that it's really difficult to capture how students or anybody are thinking and what questions they're asking about their design and how to change that design in terms of constraints, affordances, and so forth. And how do we capture that thinking in the moment as students are, deciding what to do? So there was an interesting paper I read recently where they actually mic'd the kids. They put microphones on them, and they actually were able to create an audio tape, and then they analyzed the audio tape. And when the students were in pairs, there was a very rich conversation that was happening in terms of, how are we going to overcome this constraint? How are we going to do this? The other thing that's difficult is, how does a teacher capture that? So as we have, if I have 30 students and I have, 10 groups going on, how does a teacher capture that iterative thinking and that critical thinking as they're trying to decide how to, revise their prototype, or, and then how do we understand their computational thinking and so forth? So that's what I was trying to get at. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Could you maybe, if so, can we say that we still need the research about what kind of knowledge we need to assess the critical thinking?
Absolutely. So in the makerspace, and maybe Dr. Simpson can talk about this, in makerspace research, one thing that we can't quite get our hands on is how do students who engage in makerspace activities actually change their cognition? How do they change their thinking about problem solving? And that is such a difficult dimension to acquire, to obtain. Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And we have a question from the audience here, and this is one that I think everyone has on their mind to some extent or another, but this gets back to, I think, something I believe Dr. Cross-Francis talked about, but how do we make sure that math is not overlooked or just used as a tool without conceptual development within STEM education? And I think this could be anyone who feels so moved. I think that everyone has a little something to say about this.
So I'll comment on that one. I think one of the things that you want to start by thinking about is, what are some of the big ideas in mathematics? So you want to start there. What is it that you think is meaningful for students to learn? And then start then by thinking about, and this might mean partnering with someone who has expertise in another discipline, finding compatible concepts, right? So I think what often happens, I wouldn't say often, but what happens sometimes is STEM is often driven by science. Now it's driven by engineering with the NGSS coming out, right? And so that takes the lead, and then they want to do STEM. So let me go find somebody who's doing math and see if we can fit in some math. I think as mathematics education, people in mathematics education field start to embrace them more as a space that can be mathematically enhancing and supportive, then projects will start to be initiated from mathematics individuals. And the way that you want to do that is then to think about what ideas are compatible across science and engineering that with those big ideas in mathematics. And I think that that's one of the core ways in which you can make sure that math is treated authentically and in a really rich and meaningful way. You want to start with first how you're going to develop that curriculum. And
that's a common thread throughout multiple of the presentations, this idea of intentionality and being very intentional and strategic about how to integrate these ideas together. Absolutely. Do any of the other panelists have a word to say on that before we start to wrap up?
I would like to contribute about assessment issue, because in STEM education we use engineering design notebook, which you can assess the whole process. In the also, I think I called it dynamic, not just summative or formative. It's some kind of dynamic process which assesses whole process. With the engineering design notebook, students are writing them on their own ideas and also their group ideas together in the notebook. So at the end of every course, teacher gathers them up, and then they can see how the process of students are going on the learning objectives. Also, there are the learning objectives of each module. So students, teachers need to be aware of the way they are going with the module, because sometimes it really scatters all around and the learning objectives are just the misvalues. So that might be a problem. I think the assessment should be dynamic in the STEM education.
Yeah, that's a great challenge and a great challenge for everyone in the whole field. I agree. To get that assessment to meet to rise to the challenge of the integration itself. Yes. Okay, so there are some more questions here in the chat, and it would be excellent to get around to those. I just don't think that we have the time now. I don't know if anyone, would like to talk afterward about this, maybe meet in private. However, this is the last thing we have today for the conference, and we have another plenary talk at 10 a.m. US Eastern Time, 1700 hours in Turkish time. And I'll hand it back over to the conference organizers. Thank you all. Thank you to all the panelists, to everyone who asked a question. This has been a great discussion. Thank you. Do we have maybe someone can put a link to tomorrow's schedule in the chat? I believe that would be helpful.
I'm
Yes.
sending the schedule.
Oh,
Yeah,
excellent.
Sylvia, I can
Yes.
use it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
Can't believe we're already on day 4 coming up. My gosh. Yeah. So, all right, everybody. Well, have a good evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you may be. And we hope to see as many of you as possible tomorrow. Thank you.
Lynn, nobody wants to leave.
I know.
We would
It's
like to
bizarre
go.
because there's so many good things to talk about, and I have so many notes myself, things I wish I had asked, and it's just, oh my Lord. Yeah.
We would like to continue, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, thank you very much for it.
Yes. Thank you.
Have a nice
Yeah.
conference. Bye.
Yep.
Selim hocam burada mısınız?
Mesaj attım da görmedi daha.
Hello, you finished?
Bitirdik hocam.
Yusuf Hoca ile görüşüyordum da.
Hocam yayını kapatabilir miyiz?